on the agenda, hence special. So welcome, everybody. Do we have any late items, Maurice?
There was an addition to a letter from John Enley, president of the Kimberley Nature Park Society, regarding the long-term grant application.
All right, could I have somebody move receipt? Councillor Cairns, thank you. Councillor McGuire seconds. All those in favor? Motion is carried. All right, could I have a mover to adopt the agenda for March 3rd, the special meeting held on March 3rd? Councillor McBain moves and Councillor Roberts seconds. All those in favor? Motion is carried. All right, I'd like to put the first motion on the floor prior to Krista taking the microphone, and that is that Council receive the Chief Financial Officer's presentation dated March 3rd, entitled 2025-29 Financial Plan Deliberations. Councillor McBain moves and Councillor Cairns seconds. All right, Krista, lead the way.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mayor McCormick, and good evening, Council. As mentioned, this is our third special budget meeting, and to help inform the preparation of the 2025 to 2029 5-year financial plan bylaw, we require some direction from Council on certain specific changes related to the operating side of the budget. And so that is the purpose of tonight's presentation, is looking at those changes related to operating budget. I want to pull up the presentation. Great, so we have a bit of an agenda here showing what we're going to cover tonight. First item being what we received from Council in regards to direction so far. A bit on the financial plan foundation, going into some detail on the base budget modifications and how that impacts tax, property tax adjustment, and also a slide there on outstanding items that we don't have enough information at this point yet, so we'll get into that later on into the presentation, as well as the preliminary calculation of the Aquatic Center parcel tax calculation, and then of course, water and sewer operating base budget adjustments. So we move on to Council direction received to date. So on November 18th, 2024, we had a special budget meeting to review the revenue policy overview. And during that meeting, these 3 resolutions were carried, and they relate to rates specific to water and sewer. So that first one there showing that Council approved a 5% increase to water rates, a 20% increase to the bulk water rates. That's to help us get closer to the cost of providing that service. So we're not quite there yet, but that's going to bring us closer. And then continuing with the 5% increase for sewer rates. We go to the next slide. At that same meeting, the changes to solid waste rates were also discussed. And as presented to Council, both the operating costs and reserve contributions, the budget is sufficient. So we propose that all of those rates remain unchanged for garbage collection, recycling collection, and organics collection. Further in that meeting, Council also approved that any approved annual percentage adjustment to the municipal property tax collection, if any, be the same across all property assessment classes. So we're talking residential, business, utilities. And in addition, keeping the flat tax levy the same as the 2024 level, which was $306 for improved residential properties and $386 for the unimproved residential properties. So those were some preliminary decisions that have already been made that helps inform some decisions relating to the operating budget. And then moving on, in January, we had a special budget meeting to review the 2025 to 2029 capital non-capital project plan. And during that meeting, council approved incorporating those capital non-capital projects into the 2025 to 2029 5-year financial plan, and as well as some reserve transfer resolutions there as well at the bottom. So now if we go into the what makes up the financial plan foundation. Currently, we're operating under the 2024 to 2028 financial plan. It's the we're operating under year 2 until the 2025 to 2029 financial plan can be approved or is approved in May. And so what forms that base budget for that financial plan foundation is already included a 3.9% increase to property tax collection. And as noted there at the bottom is that base budget also included an increase to property tax, which included $100,000 related to anticipated new tax related to non-market assessment change. And I'll get into more detail further into the presentation about what entails in that calculation. So if we go to the next slide, this is a bit of a summary on how we can see the base budget, where we started out and what the proposed changes are throughout this presentation. And then that final and last column is the resulting proposed budget. I will just make a note there that that first line is a bit of an error. It didn't reflect a latest change. So the proposed changes under property taxes is actually 682,504 rather than the reported 653,373, resulting in the total proposed property taxes being $14.414,889. And the offsetting change on the expense side is on the next slide, but this gives a bit of a breakdown of how the changes that are being proposed throughout this presentation impacts the type of revenue that's received. And then on the next slide, we'll see the resulting impact to expenditures. We want to.
So just to clarify, Krista.
Sure.
So that, pardon me, the 653,000 represents 3.9% of the 2024 taxes.
So it includes the proposed increase as in this presentation, plus the non-market change transfer that's also being proposed later in the presentation. So we'll get into that into greater detail.
Okay, thank you.
So this is the one representing revenues. This is a slide that shows the breakdown for expenditures. So the other adjusting side for that adjustment that was made on the property tax line is will come out of the recreation and cultural services. So that rather than $155,076, it's it should read $125,945. And then you can see the total expenditures offset the total revenue, leaving a surplus of $0. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide. So when we're talking about the base budget and the changes that we're reviewing tonight, these changes are typically as a result of either higher than anticipated inflation factor, adjustment to reflect historical actuals, the implementation of operational efficiencies, increase and decrease to supply, council approve amendments to fees and changes. So there's a list there of what could possibly change, require a change to the base budget. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll go into detail of what's been proposed under the general fund.
So just before you go, Council, any questions or comments at this point? We'll try and do that in bite size. Go ahead, Councillor Fox.
Just a question, a couple questions actually on the revenue slide. What's other?
I would have to go into some detail on the operating budget side to see exactly what makes up that other.
What normally constitutes other?
Pardon me?
What normally would constitute other? Like some examples.
Well, we can see that the majority of the funding is represented in the like property taxes, your grants and interest. So it'd be the combination of all of those things that don't fall into those categories.
But what is that?
Sorry, I don't have that.
Okay,
historical
it's just,
data.
I'm
Yeah.
just, it's just a
Okay.
curious thing because I don't.
We'll come
yeah,
back to it.
Yeah. Can I ask one other one about this? What's
ahead.
grants in lieu of taxes?
So those are properties that, or utilities where they pay a percentage of their revenues to the city rather than paying taxes.
Is there an
So
example?
It's Fortis, it's
Oh, okay, that makes
Shaw
more sense. Okay, thank you,
or
Okay.
Janelle Rogers.
And then I think I had one about, no, okay, that's good. Thank you.
Thanks, Krista.
No problem. So this is just a summary of what we're going to review in detail in the upcoming slides. So that first box at the top is representing additions to the base budget, what we're proposing for additional expenditures. And that top line is we're proposing an additional contribution to capital reserves, which is a 1.5% dedicated percentage from property tax. And I'll go into more detail about that. But you see that makes up the most of that increase, as well as the RCMP contract. The next box down are proposed reductions to the base budget. And again, I'll get into a little bit more detail about the community grants reduction there. And that adjustments to reflect historical spending is actually a combination of several adjustments just for several different line items where we're adjusting to what we're actually seeing as part of historical spending. And so we can see the net impact of that is actually reducing expenditures by 23,000. So these two boxes represent all the internal proposed adjustments. And that's resulting in a net addition to the base operating budget of $353,393. And we've also this year have some external requests, and they're specific to long-term grant requests for the Kimberley Helping Hands Food Bank and the Kimberley Nature Park Society. So with those, plus the internal requests, we have net additions proposed tonight for $394,393. So we can get into some of the specific adjustments, some of the proposed changes here. The first one is in reference to a new occupational health and safety advisor. The addition of this position was previously discussed during last year's budget deliberations and was proposed to be revisited for implementation in 2025. And it's anticipated that this position would help facilitate the annual core audit, manage the city's occupational health and safety program, manage any incidents and their associated return to work plans. It'll also allow the human resources to redirect their focus to human resource specific tasks, including policy review, employee delivery, training delivery, tracking time and attendance, and as well as records management. So as noted here, and last year was noted that it was proposed that in the previous year that a new HR information system would be implemented. However, that was deferred and subsequently reduced the operating budget by that 39,000. And with this, we would be proposing that a tax increase would be proposed in order to fund the position. And of course, it's only as we're partway through the year, we're proposing that it would be about approximately half the year, which would require a tax increase of approximately 0.37%. Jim?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, we have the manager of HR, Lindsay, here. So maybe we can ask her to speak to a little bit about the core audit and just what that is, Lindsay, and the fact that it's anticipated that once that process is complete and we've received that certification, that there will be some savings to our WorkSafe BC premiums, which will help fund the position eventually. you could just touch on,
Yep.
on that, that'd be great.
Great. Thank you for having me tonight. So yeah, a quick overview of the CORE project, or its Certificate of Recognition is what CORE stands for. And it's achieved by organizations who have exemplary health and safety programs in their organization. So there is a financial incentive to be earned every year of just over $24,000. And then the savings that Jim had previously referred to, for us, we've had calculated to equal, I think it's about $65,000. And I think the total ends up being somewhere around $94,000 would be the total monetary either savings and reward for obtaining and maintaining CORE certification. It is an incredibly large project. We did a pre-audit back in November of 2023, and I had been working with BCMSA to kind of finalize all of the gaps in our documentation, in our processes, everything like that. So we did identify 5 major areas that needed attention. And since then, we've worked with a consultant to prepare the documents that we were missing, identify the processes that we needed to have documented that we also were missing. So it was quite eye-opening, and quite a lot of work went into it. I'm hoping to engage that same consultant to actually implement the finished program now that we've sent the documents out to staff and management for review, just for any feedback to make sure that it will actually work for our organization. And we're hoping to begin implementation in the next month or two. And then we would like to have the new program enacted for 6 months, hopefully, just to see if it's working, if there are any places we need to make any improvements to. And then from there, we'll apply for our first audit, and that is conducted by the external agency, not by an internal member of staff. And then every other year, we have to alternate with an internal staff member who's trained and certified to perform the CORE audits, and an external body who would rotate year in, year out to perform these audits. We have to pass the audits every year in order to maintain our standing and in order to keep reaping those benefits. So, I mean, not only is it a huge improvement to our existing health and safety program, but also, again, the financial impact is great.
So just to clarify then, the expenditure for this FTE is about $48,000.
For this year, that would be
this year.
yes, for the remainder of this year.
So
once
that
the
represents
position.
0.73%.
I think what that is that's what it is. We're requesting a tax increase of 0.73% to
Right.
cover the full.
So what I'm trying to
cost.
understand, Lindsay,
Yeah.
is we're going to have a benefit here of $95,000. What's it going to cost us to have the position in?
I think I estimated the salary for that position just based on salary comparisons with surrounding municipalities, similar sized municipalities. So a salary not including the benefits amount, I think, was around about $75,000. And then with the benefits cost, that closer to 100?
Yeah.
So it's roughly going to be a break even.
Hopefully.
That's the plan.
But eventually, I'd like to see us really decreasing our premium costs, and then that will result in greater savings.
Yeah, fair enough. Just
Yeah.
trying to find on balance here. We're going to spend this much this year in order to facilitate getting that $95,000. And once it's there and we're in kind of normal mode, one will offset the other. So we're not looking at a long-term
Yeah.
increase.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Thanks.
Currently paying anything? Is there a cost right now? Not having the proper?
Our premiums are higher than average and have been significantly for quite a few years based on our usage of our benefits, as well as our short-term and long-term disability usage as well. And so what we're really hoping with implementing the new program, as well as having somebody dedicated to monitor and work with people who are injured at work, is keeping them at work, creating modified return to work programs to get people back to the workplace sooner. And all of those things have a positive impact on the premiums. We've had an increase every year since I've been here to our premium rates because of our poor usage or poor record. I'm hoping so. I hope so. Yeah.
Okay, further, Council?
Just briefly,
Go ahead, Jim.
Mr. Mayor, we're talking a lot about money here because it's a budget meeting, but really the primary purpose of this position, it's health and safety related. It's all about ensuring a safer workplace for the employees. That's all about.
Thank you. Councillor Roberts, go ahead.
Just a little point of confirmation for myself. You talked about a FTE, full-time employee. Is that the consultant or is that a new on-staff person?
This would be a new on-staff person. So we already have approved budget from previous years for the consultant and the work that he's doing. So once that project is done, and I'm also not sure if we're going to use all of that budget, just based on kind of where we're sitting right now. But then the FTE that we're referring to in the presentation is an actual full-time addition to the Human Resources Department to focus solely on the health and safety.
Okay. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Councillor Roberts. Further? Go ahead, Krista.
Thank you, Lindsay. So if we go on to the next item, we have IT software licensing. So cyber threats are on the rise and municipalities are in a vulnerable position due to the lack of dedicated resources. And because of this vulnerability, they have become a target for criminals, municipalities have. So to better safeguard the city's data, a request of an additional approximately 31,000 for additional software subscriptions has been proposed here to help build a more robust IT network. And then we've also got a significant portion pertaining to records management and just making sure that we have the budget in place to support that project as we progress with the records management program. So that top item there is an additional $4,750 for a subscription related to a non-capital project that we had in the capital plan with the implementation of a high availability firewall. Those next two items pertain to records management specifically, and then some smaller licensing additions all pertain to further security. And then the remainder pertaining to cost increases for licenses that we currently have in place.
Questions? Continue.
Okay. So the next item is related to transit services. So BC Transit has provided a 3-year draft budget. And in that budget, they're projecting a slight reduction in revenues and greater increases to expenses. So they go on and explain that this budget reflects general industry trends, location-based operations and maintenance activities, and any specific initiatives planned for our transit system over the next 3 years. And for Kimberley, those specific initiatives include expanded winter shuttle service, an extra bus, and additional service hours. So overall, that meant in a little bit of more detail here, the net reduction of revenues was about $5,520, a net increase of expenses of $47,000, and this will be explained on the next slide as well. So the total impact is going to be $52,596. However, BC Transit has funds held in reserve for the city to use at their discretion. So staff have chosen to apply that reserve to help offset the costs in 2025. And as their fiscal years runs from April to March, 3/4 of those reserve funds would be applied in 2025 and the remaining quarter would be applied in 2026. So to explain this sort of all in summary, we have a table on the next slide that shows this in detail, just what I was explaining here. On the far right, what was additionally required. You can see that total revenue was reduced by $5,520. Transit expenses going up by the 47, which gets us to the net transit expense of 52,000, and then being reduced by the transit reserve withdrawal of 23,000, bringing us to the net adjustment of 29,000, which would need to be subsidized by property tax.
Go ahead, Councillor McBain.
Yeah, just kind of curious, from I think most reports that we've heard on transit in our area, the demand has either been quite good or growing. So it's just kind of surprising to see that the revenue is essentially down. Was there an explanation for that? Or just kind of curious?
It's good question, good comment. I find it curious too. I think we've shown that our ridership's been continuing to kind of build back up, and so I think they were actually projecting a little slightly larger decrease in revenue, and so we've kind of softened that out a bit or balanced it out a bit on our own kind of estimate there on revenues. I mean, yeah, we've seen pretty positive growth. I mean, there's a certain limit to how much you can grow that without really changing the system. So yeah, we're I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I think they're anticipating. I think that might be more of like kind of the the system-wide or the province-wide trends that they're kind of projecting on us. And I think more locally, I think we've seen stable or generally growing ridership, I think so.
Yeah, so further, if I may, so is there like two different sets of data that you guys pull from or something, Troy? Like if we're seeing ridership, or at least we've been reported on that ridership is increasing, but then ticket sales are down, is there like two different sets of data or?
Well, I mean, we definitely rely heavily on the budget projections that BC Transit provides, but we do try to track, ridership and have our own estimation of all that. So, like I said, we've adjusted that a bit on the revenue side. We rely heavily on the expenses side. Those increased expenses are in part by the winter shuttle expansion that we're well aware of that's been implemented this season. But other parts is just fuel and maintenance expenses that are expected to rise, of course. But so yeah, hopefully we can kind of keep those in check and stay on budget here.
Further? Good. This is 3 routes, kind of all 3.
There's 4.
There's
altogether,
4.
Yeah, so the sort of the 2 routes back and forth to Cranbrook, the commuter and the health connections, the winter shuttle, and then our local service, which is the in-demand in town.
So this is the net of all 4 of
It's
those.
4 together, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Troy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Troy. Okay, if we move on to the next one, it relates to the RCMP contract. So historically, city practice has been to approve 8 full-time equivalent RCMP members for the local police unit, and then subsequently request that the RCMP manage the local unit such that the actual number of FTE members utilized is equivalent to 7 FTE. I've noted here that this year's forecast for 2024 estimates that the actual member usage will be approximately 5.4, so significantly lower than the 7 FTE. At the August 26, 2024 regular meeting, council was advised through a presentation that the 7 FTEs based on a per member cost and overtime projections as provided in the RCMP municipal contract policing multi-year plan totaled 1.3 million. And this is $142,742 over the base budget that's included for 2025. And in that multi-year plan, they are attributing a significant portion of that increase to a non-contractual estimate of 3.5% for members' pay increases, as well as significant upgrading of and modernization of intervention equipment. So city does hold an RCMP contract reserve, and its balance currently is $385,871. We've already attributed $218,000 of those funds to pay for the retro payment that resulted from the ratification of the collective agreement that was done back in 2021. And it's also there to help the city fund any unanticipated cost overages. So those funds are really there to fund those unexpected expenditures. So for this $142,000, we are seeking a tax increase in order to fund that incremental increase.
So a couple of questions, Krista. So if our actual member usage was 5.4, is that what we pay for
Correct.
So we had budgeted for 7, but the actual was only 5.4. What has happened to the balance, the difference?
They have adjustments for overtime and as well as severance agreements. So there's various adjustments throughout the year that eat into that difference as well.
Okay. So yeah, okay, good. I've got another question for a bit later. And I guess just a comment for kind of council's edification. An example of an extraordinary expense happened here just a few weeks ago when the SWAT team needed to be called in from Kelowna. You'll recall there was that incident up at Kimberley Lodging where there was a male who was threatening violence, I guess would be for a better term. And they had to call a SWAT team in. Whenever something like that happens, we're on the hook for the cost of bringing in those extra expenses. And that's why it's important that we have that reserve in place to be able to account for those possibilities, if not probabilities. Each of the events are kind of on their own merit, Kevin. I mean, we go back and find out what that one was specifically when that cost finally comes in. Yep. You can take note of that. It's lots. Yeah.
So far we got extremely lucky. We had possible one, I think it was in 2023, and it got resolved before the SWAT team got deployed, and the one at the scale most recently. We haven't had any for several years, so.
Go ahead, Councillor McGuire.
Yeah, my guess is that if we don't use these funds, they just go into reserves. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the intent and hopeful plan going forward. And we hope to include that specifically, formalize that direction as part of our reserve fund policy that we plan to implement and bring toward in front of council later this year.
Okay, and so essentially we're just anticipating costs and having funds available for unforeseen circumstances and staffing issues, et cetera. Okay.
That's correct.
Yeah, I'm fine with this.
Thanks, Councillor McGuire. Go ahead, Krista.
Okay. On a related note, the Kimberley RCMP detachment has 2 municipal clerk positions who provide administration and clerical support to the local detachment. And when either of those staff members are absent, casual coverage is required to maintain sufficient service levels. And previously, the base budget provided for 3.5 weeks of casual coverage, and it's proven not to be sufficient. So we're putting in a request to bump that up by 6.5 weeks to ensure that they can maintain the necessary coverage to keep the work proceeding.
Are those 2 FTEs part of the contract?
No, they're municipal employees.
Right, okay. Thanks.
They are union employees.
Yep. Further, Council? Go ahead, Councillor McGuire.
Yeah, it's actually in relation to the previous slide. I'm just curious, if we're approving 7 FTE as a way of budgeting, I just feel like it's a little bit disingenuous if we're actually having whatever it was, 4.5 or 5.5. And I'm just curious why we're budgeting like that rather than saying, 5.5 full-time equivalents is what we're approving and then having some sort of contingency for unforeseen.
Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Maybe I'll just jump in on this one. We're required every year. I think it was in January where we sent a letter to the RCMP. We're obligated to provide them with the commitment indicating we're budgeting for those 7 FTEs. The reason that there was only 5.4 this year, it's just due to unforeseen absences with the RCMP, whether it be medical leave or those types of absences. We don't really have any control over that. Councillor Woodcox does his best to maintain that full contingent, but it's a challenge at times, I think.
If I may add, what happens when we're lower in the FTE is that our overtime goes up. So it kind of usually adjusts itself.
Awesome.
Thank you. Okay, then if you go on to the next slide, we're talking about the planning position restructuring. It actually has a zero impact to the 2025 budget. Maurice, if we want to advance the slides here. So in November, council approved a budget increase of 60,000 to support the restructuring of positions within the planning department. And the restructuring included replacing the vacant full-time planner position, as well as a 0.65 FTE operations clerk. 0.65 of the position was to help support the planning department. And those two would be replaced with a new full-time unionized planning technician and a new full-time exempt senior planner. So the reason it's not impacting the budget in 2025 is that the original calculations brought before council at that time were based on conservative remuneration estimates, as well as based on a full year salary or wages. The actual start dates of these positions is actually going to be not until the end of this month. So it'll only impact 3/4 of the budget this year. So with the late start date and the conservative estimates, it actually, the base budget is enough to cover the adjustment for 2025. So no property tax increases required for 2025, but as noted there, it will impact 2026 at approximately 0.38% of a property tax increase.
Are those positions hired?
Finally, yes, they'll be in their seats by the end of the month, I think. So
Awesome. Thanks, Troy.
Okay. So on the next slide, it references the contribution to capital reserves, which I had mentioned when on the summary table there, that first line of $196,000 increase. And this would be for a dedicated annual 1.5% tax adjustment to address our gap of reserve contributions to what is needed to fund our capital projects. So at the January 20th special budget meeting where we reviewed the 2025 capital and non-capital plan, we've discussed the impact of inflation to our infrastructure projects. And as I've noted there, and this was pulled from that report, that since 2020, infrastructure project costs have increased 67%. And as well as fleet acquisitions have increased anywhere from 21 to 84%. So as a result, all of our budgeted increases for reserves to contribution has been in effect going directly to inflation rather than addressing the gap for our infrastructure renewal. And that gap being the amount, the 8.8 million, which is what is proposed in our asset management investment plan as what is needed to actually bring us up to a level that we can renew our infrastructure in the city. So this table was pulled right from that report, the 67% inflationary increase. And then the 30% that we were contributing to reserves is leaving us in a deficit of that 37%. So to partially offset the impact of inflation and improve the city's ability to fund critical capital projects, we are proposing that this $196,000 of taxation revenue be transferred to general capital reserves. And we're also proposing that this continue into the future so that there's some future stability as far as contribution to reserve and ensure that that funding is in place to help us renew the capital. And we can see the impact that this 1.5% increase would have on the next slide. So we can see that 196 across the board for 2025 to 2029, and then the cumulative 1.5% increase each year, resulting in that $3.2 million of additional reserve funds. And as I noted in between the tables there, that, and this was pulled from the presentation back in January as well, is that the, to put this into context, it costs approximately $1.5 million to construct a typical one block infrastructure project within the city. And so we can see that the 2029 contributions don't even get us to that point yet. So that bottom table there shows what we are currently putting into reserves, which is approximately 3%. So that's that top line, the current, and then with the proposed additional 1.5%, where we would be totaling 4.2 million in 2025, up to 5.5 in 2029.
Go ahead, Councillor McBain.
Yeah, just a general comment. I really appreciate this proposal. In one sense, I understand there's sensitivities. Anytime you want that you're going to raise taxes for any purposes, there's got to be a rational explanation why. And when I look at what was presented to us, I can't remember the date, but when you guys presented the impacts to the costs and infrastructure, and recognizing that this council and the previous council that I was on, infrastructure deficit reduction was up there on the priority list, if not the top priority. I think, again, the reason I appreciate this proposal is it's looking down the road. We're paying ourselves for the future to take care of things and hopefully minimize some uncertainty too. And I guess the part I would tack on to that presentation that you gave us before, there is a lot of macroeconomic uncertainty right now. And those costs that were reported on by the staff, which did a great job of that, we don't even know how much more it's going to magnify now. So making prudent decisions like this, even though it's maybe a little bit unpopular in some regards, to me is a really wise move. So just thank you for proposing this.
Thanks. Thanks for those comments, Councillor McBain. Go ahead, Jim.
Maybe just to provide a bit more context, I mean, if you look out at the end of the 5 years, and if that increase is approved annually, that $1.12 million doesn't look like a whole lot at the end of that, but it is significant. Just as an example, some of the bigger projects, once we get into facilities, it's unlikely we're going to be able to fund those with just annual reserve contributions. We're probably going to have to borrow for some of these larger projects, and that 1.12 would fund over a 25-year period at current rates. We could borrow $16 million and fund it with that. So, I mean, that amount of money will make a difference. The infrastructure deficit for sure.
That's a great context. Further to Councillor McBain's comments, it's unfortunate we didn't start doing this 5 years ago or 6 years ago when the original asset management assessment was put in place. But it takes time to assess, takes time to understand consequences. And here we are in 2025, and this is definitely better late than never. I think more than at any other time, certainly since I've been here, we have such a good handle on our infrastructure, what the requirements are, where the deficits are, and where the priorities are. I think staff have done an awesome job of spelling that out for us, and I think it's pretty clear what we need to do. Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have a little bit of a question about the 8.8 million that we talk about as being the piece that we needed all the way along the way to be able to be healthy. The 8.8 million. So we're going to start putting a couple $100,000 a year into that and paying it through taxes. Do we never take anything out of it until we reach that 8 million, or is it a moving target all the time?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, we're almost pulling money out of reserves as fast as we're putting it in. We do try to maintain a bit of a constant level in each of the various reserves, and this reserve policy that Krista refers to, the idea behind that is that we will set minimum, maximum levels, annual reserve contribution levels. But yeah, the intention of reserves isn't to dump a bunch of money in and watch that grow. That $8 million, it's a target through the asset management investment plan on, you know, how much we should be putting away. And as we've talked about a lot around this table, we're a long ways from that. This is making a small dent in it, I guess.
Councillor McGuire?
Yeah, and if I'm understanding correctly, these reserves could be pulled for inflationary increases that we're not seeing even for this year. And we'll have the reserved fund to pull from rather than going into debt, for example, to pay for some of these inflationary increases or having to cancel projects.
Thanks for those comments. Go ahead, Krista.
Okay. So if we move on to the next slide, this is referencing that $78,000 reduction as a result of the decision that council made in October of 2024 to amend the community grants policy. And during that meeting, it was proposed to reduce the community grant allocation made towards project and event grants for 2025 and 2026 as well, as we can see here. So the approved allocation for 2025 ends up in the resulting 78,344 reduction to the base budget for 2025. So that actually reduces the property tax increase by 0.60%. Questions on that piece? No?
Go ahead.
Okay. So the slides up to this point have all been adjustments or proposals from the internal side. This next slide talks a bit about the external budget requests we received, and those total $41,000, and that's the sum of two grant requests made at the January 13th, 2025 regular council meeting. At that meeting, both the Kimberley Helping Hands Food Bank and the Kimberley Nature Park Society made requests of council for a long-term, or they were previously called standing grants, but now they're referred to as long-term grants. The food bank is requesting $25,000, $10,000 pertaining to food costs and $15,000 to wages. And then the Nature Park Society is requesting $16,000. So if approved in accordance with the community grant policy, an inflationary increase of 1.5% would be applied to those approved grants for the remaining term of council, which is the new term that coincides with long-term grants, and after which those grant recipients will be required to reapply. So at the bottom there, I've noted the impact to property tax, the property tax increase if those grants were to be approved. And it is 1.9% for the food bank and 0.12% for the Nature Park Society. And if both were approved, it would impact the tax increase by 0.31%.
Councillor McGuire.
So we're approving the budget for these two items. Does that mean we're also approving the grants?
They will be separate
They're
resolutions.
separate resolutions for each of those grants. Yeah.
Okay. So on the next slide, we've summarized all of these changes and the associated property tax impact with each one. So at the top there, we have the included increase that was included in the base budget with the adoption of the 2024-2020 to 2028 financial plan bylaw, and that is at 3.98%. And then we see each line item as talked about this evening, and the total internal request totaling 2.7% tax increase, which brings us to a total tax collection adjustment of 6.68, just with those internal proposed adjustments. And if we add on the two external requests, that 3.1% increase, that brings us to a 6.99% should council approve everything that's been proposed here tonight. And that number at the bottom is just representing the impact to the average single family home as estimated with the preliminary completed roll of what that 6.99% impact would look on that single family home, which is the value of 572,000, and that the impact on taxes would be approximately $201.08.
All right, council, questions, comments? Go ahead, Councilor McBain.
I guess I'd just go to the comparison of the tax adjustments in our local area, and given that we're, you know, kind of in the meaty part of the curve there, and given, you know, the request to add to our reserves that we just talked about here recently. I mean, I would have to say that I applaud staff for the work that they've done. You know, considering where we fall in the rest of the group, and considering what we're asking, I think you guys have done a really good job in a very challenging environment, and we haven't given up just in the way of services. I mean, I know there's some significant concessions, but at the same time, I think overall we've done a pretty good job maintaining services.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. Councillor Fox, go ahead.
Just sort of, I mentioned this to Jim earlier, but I actually don't find the adjustment comparisons very useful. Not a criticism of you, by the way. But it's more like, I don't know what, like, is this for a 10% increase in Rossland? I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what their level of service is like. I don't know what that translates to. So this actually, I don't find it to be a very valuable piece of information. It's just sort of a point of reference that when you break it down kind of doesn't really mean anything. What I do think is meaningful and incredibly important, and the thing that I wish that we were really focusing on and talking about, is the part where it breaks down kind of like the estimated property tax increase for an average person, which is essentially less than $20 a month. So as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of things about this budget that's awesome, because that's not a lot of money, but the way we talk about it, I find really problematic. And that's not you, Krista, at all. But I think it's like, yeah, I'd really like to see us frame these things a little bit differently, because I think it's actually very palatable when someone goes $20 a month isn't less than $20 a month, kind of isn't a big amount of money, right? But a 7% tax increase, I was raised in Alberta, like this made my blood boil, like how dare the government put their hands in their pocket. And then when I actually read it and broke it down and did the math and all of that, I was like, oh, this is not that bad, but it sounds bad. So that's something that I'd like to see us kind of see if we can change.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the comments, Councillor. Go ahead, Councillor McBain.
Yeah, I appreciate Councillor Fox asking for you know, actual amounts rather than percentages. I think you're right. It does have a pretty good. It can put things in perspective. With the comment on the adjustment comparisons, I think one thing that's impressive, and we talk about it a lot every time we go through our budget deliberations, we know how we weigh against other communities with respect to percentage of revenue coming from residential versus every other funding source. And we know that there's nobody even really near us. And the fact that we're in the middle of that curve with respect to other municipalities who have a significant lead on us with respect to commercial and industrial and other forms of revenue. To me, again, that speaks to us doing a pretty good job of keeping things as balanced as we possibly can.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. The only municipality that is equivalent to us or in the same ballpark is Rossland.
Okay.
So a question with regard to inflation. Each year there is an average inflationary number that we have built in. What is that number this year?
It's actually varies depending on the type of expenditure. So we're looking at, around 2.5% for goods and services. There's 3% built in for insurance, 5% for wages. So it's a complex calculation, but it varies on the type of expenditure.
I guess what I'm trying to understand, Krista, of the 6.99%, how much of that is just inflation?
Well, as I mentioned, it's
Not asking for an exact number, just approximate.
There
Is
is,
it 2%? I know the CPI is something like 2%. Then I don't know, just a ballpark. Because I think the point I'm making here is the 6.99 is not an addition to new services that are coming in, or, you know, a lot of those cost increases. They are taking into account what we need to keep the levels of service we have operating at those levels. And I just think it's important for us around the table, as well as the general public, to understand what that is.
right. So I haven't done the calculations. It would require a bit of work on my part, and I can certainly do that. In previous years, there has been a municipal price index that we applied, but we moved away from that to better represent what the true costs or true inflationary impact to the city is.
Okay.
So
So it would be useful if you could follow up with that.
Sure.
Just in terms of talking points that we're going to have with folks we run into in the coffee shops and around town.
excellent, I can do that.
Thank you.
Okay, so that previous slide summarized what we talked about to this point. The next, we're going to talk a little bit about non-market change and non-market assessment change. And here we can see that we're proposing a $288,000 addition to the budget. And this is because in accordance with the 2025 completed roll, which is the preliminary first initial roll for 2025. We'll soon see the revised roll at the end of this month. But based on those preliminary numbers, we're seeing a $62.7 million worth of taxable assessment being added to the city's taxation roll. And I've broken that down there at the table of how that applies to residential utilities, business, and recreation. And we can see that 52.1 million is associated to residential. So with that total new taxation assessment, if it remains that amount, it would represent a $388,111 in additional tax revenue. So as I mentioned on the Financial Plan Foundation slide, we've already budgeted for $100,000 of non-market change. So the difference between those two amounts, the 288,000, is unanticipated revenue. So as mentioned previously, to help with our reserves and the contributions to reserves to help fund capital projects, we are proposing that this unexpected revenue, additional revenue of 288,000, be transferred to a reserve. And additionally, we're proposing that this practice be continued in future years as well.
All right, awesome. Questions or comments, Council? Go ahead, Councillor Roberts.
A reserve, like just a general, let's keep it for later type reserve? Does it have a name or?
It would go into our general capital reserve.
General
that's
capital
the
reserve,
pooled
okay.
fund for which we withdraw for our capital projects. And the next table the next slide, sorry, gives a breakdown of if we were to add that additional non-market assessment change transferred onto the 1.5% that we proposed earlier in the presentation, how that would look and impact our contributions to reserves. So we've got that current level, which is the 3%, the additional 1.5% plus this non-market change transfer. And we can see that would result in approximately 4.5 in 2025. And just to note that the non-market change, assessment change, we don't know what that's going to be for future years. So we've just plugged in what it was for this year to give an estimate of how it would look at the same rate going forward.
So just to clarify again, under current, that 4,015,000, going forward for the 5 years, that represents the contribution coming from the current year's tax revenue.
That's what has already been built in from previous and approved from previous financial plans.
Right.
To be
So of
contributed.
all the taxation coming in the current year, 4 million is going to go into those general reserves. And then with the addition of the 1.5 and the non-market change, that will add an extra $500,000 to the reserve contribution.
That's correct.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Further, Council? Go ahead, Councillor Roberts.
All of a sudden, 8.8 million doesn't look so far out of whack, does it?
Making headway.
Excellent.
Go ahead, Krista.
Okay, so the next slide is what both Councillor McBain and Councillor Fox were referring to with comparing the proposed tax increase here in Kimberley to other potential tax increases in other communities. And it is correct, each municipality has unique opportunities, unique challenges, so it's not.
Well, they also have, none of us have assessments that are equal,
Right.
Which is what the basis for this is. Single family home here is about $300,000 less than it is in Fernie, for example. So yeah, there are a whole bunch of reasons why those comparisons are not necessarily valid. Councillor McGuire.
So I guess my question is, you know, I think we were around what, 288 plus 196, so 488 into reserves. I'm just curious, what were we putting into reserves last year in our budget? Was it zero at that point, or?
So the 4,015,000 that you see on that first line there, that slide for 2015, there's a increase built in the 5-year financial plan of right around 3% for the general reserve. So it would have been 3% less than that. So
Yeah, I'm just pointing out that these additional, you know, we're looking at about 4% of an addition to our general reserves, which will put us in a good position to do some of these major infrastructure repairs that are needed within our community. And you know, when you're looking at the budget, it's almost like if we didn't have those additional 4% going into general reserves, we would be looking at a CPI increase this year. But the extra 4% is going directly towards kind of getting ahead of the 8 ball, where we've been behind the 8 ball for, in my judgment, the last 40 years.
Thanks, Councillor.
Okay.
Go ahead, Krista.
Excellent. So if we skip ahead 2 slides, then Maurice, we'll go into the outstanding items that haven't been included in this presentation tonight. So as I mentioned, all the information in this presentation is based on the completed assessment roll, which was received at the beginning of the year. And there could be changes, and any material changes could materially change the calculations as included in this presentation. So that's just something to be aware of. Similarly, the non-market change could also vary from what we've already been provided as part of the completed roll. So again, any changes to that would impact that reserve to the transfer to reserve as proposed.
Yeah. What's our history with that?
Last year we were about 90,000 over the $100,000 budget. So it was about $190,000 was the total tax the additional tax resulting from the non-market assessment change. Prior years, I don't have that data on me, but
Okay.
it does vary.
Go ahead, Joe.
yeah, just with regard to the non-market change, BC assessment, I'm finding is getting a lot closer at those estimates. In previous years, going back 4 or 5, 6 years ago, the number that they would provide with the completed roll often varied widely from the revised roll. So it was really difficult to rely on it. But
Up or
it's,
down?
all over the place.
Okay.
So it is a lot better now. I feel confident that it'll be close to what's in the completed roll.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, and that next item there is renewal of expired agreements. So, if we go back to the previous slide there, these are the information. We didn't have enough information to this point to include this as part of the presentation, but we hope before the adoption of the financial plan, we will have more information to bring back to council to address any increases that might result of the renewal of these agreements. And I've just noted here that currently there's 0% inflationary increase to these amounts in the 5-year financial plan. And the current allocations to each is 25,500 for the Chamber of Commerce and 31,750 for the Tourism Kimberley Visitors Center. So that'll be brought before council at a later date.
So both of those numbers are in the budget, but no inflationary increase.
That's correct. And then that last item there, I had
Hang on a
mentioned,
sec, Krista.
sorry.
Go ahead, Councillor.
I'm just curious as to why there's no change over the 5 years, why there's no interest added to that, why there's.
Inflationary increase?
Yes, that's the word, thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, both of those agreements are currently expired right now. So I had a bit of back and forth with the chamber manager today, and I've been provided with a draft fee for service agreement. So it's just a matter of renegotiating those agreements, and then we'll build those new numbers into the budget going forward.
Go ahead, Krista.
Okay. So I previously mentioned that the RCMP's contract budget was based on the municipal contract policing multi-year plan. However, that plan did not include provisions for the arbitral decisions made in 2024. They didn't have that information, so that's not included as part of that $172,000 increase for the RCMP contract. So if they come back with some significant deviations from that information, then that will require further tax adjustments as well.
So that adjustment will be annually going forward. It's not something that we can pay out of the reserve.
Correct.
Okay. Councilor McPay?
Okay.
So if it's a one-time thing, we can use the reserve. If it's ongoing operations, then we need to take.
That's a good way of wording it, yes. Okay, the next slide is just mentioning there are options to reduce the 2025 tax increase, and that's by deferring, reducing, or eliminating any of the proposed changes in the presentation tonight, as described in the presentation tonight, reducing service levels, increasing user fees, permit and license fees, possibly directing some or all of that non-market assessment change tax revenue could be applied back to the tax increase to reduce that. And then that last item is referring to the 3% budgeted contributions to capital, general capital reserve. So just saying that if we dip into that, then that further impacts our ability to pay for capital. But those are a few options available to council.
So if I may, Krista, I mean, all of these things are options to look at. What they tend to be, though, is 1 year kinds of things that in the next year, they tend to come back and you have to pay twice as much because you didn't take the increase in the year that you should have. A perfect example of that was when COVID started in 2020. March was when the lockdown started, and we were approving the budget within a month or two during the lockdown, and we chose to take a 0% tax increase. You may recall that we had an awful lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt happening at that point. And so council chose to take a 0% increase, but inflation didn't stop. And in fact, we ended up 2% or more behind at the end of that year. The following year, we took a 1.3% increase, which got us even further behind. And in that third year, if I remember correctly, we had to take a 5.5% increase just to catch up on that inflation that we had deferred. So, you know, deferrals to try and keep the number down, they're a very temporary thing. And it's one of the reasons why we got into trouble with previous council decisions. And I mean, the perfect one had to do with 10 years of no increases to water rates. That was one, and there are probably 2 or 3 others that we've run into here over the past couple of years that they are lessons learned, and you have to pay for what you have to pay for. So Go ahead, Krista.
Okay, so based on all the information that's been presented so far, we propose some council resolutions of council here, and it's a little bit small. I'm hoping you can read it, but
So these are the resolutions that are in the agenda, correct? So if I could suggest that unless there's any further questions or comments, we call the question on receipt. Go ahead.
This is just sort of a bit of a philosophical comment, and Jim and I talked about this a little bit earlier today. But I noticed, I said this a little bit earlier, like when I first read it, my initial reaction was I was really angry because it was an increase in taxes and it was like, how dare, right? And all of that. And then the more I read it, it seemed less sinister. And then it's the thing where I don't think we do a very good job of putting it into context for people for what it means in their lives. And I think that is incredibly important. So the most important piece of data to me in this entire document is the one that tells someone if my house is $572,000, my taxes go up $200 a year or less than $20 a month. I think that there's a lot of ways that we can frame it that don't sound sinister because taxes aren't bad. They're not sinister. It's not bad to pay taxes. They pay all our salaries. I don't know what you do for work. Maybe they don't pay yours, but like they pay all of our salaries, right? So they're not a bad thing and they're how we get service.
Small pills are easy to swallow.
And I think the other thing that really struck me when I was reading it is how some things are budget additions and some things are budget adjustments and some things are tax adjustments and some things are tax increases. And the one that really bothers me is that when we talk about increasing staff or adding an FTE, it's always a tax increase. It's always a 1% tax increase. And if we put it in the context of the $572,000, and you can correct me if my math is wrong on this, Krista, but that works out to about $28 a year for that person for one FTE. Is that roughly right? Is that my math on that about right? $28-ish a year? Yeah, that communicates very differently to people than a 1% tax increase. And I think a lot of people would not find it problematic because that's less than the price of a cup of coffee a month. Not a day, a month at any place in this town. So I also don't like the connotation that there's something negative about staff. Lots of people don't like anything that perceives an increase to money coming out of their pocket. I think there's a lot of really negative rhetoric in the world right now. I think there's a lot of really negative rhetoric towards government. And I don't think that we need to be putting anything out that adds to that. And I'm not comfortable with language that adds to that. So.
Thanks, Councillor Fox. Councillor McBain.
Yeah, I guess I tend to agree with what you're saying. I think it's, I'm very comfortable living in the world of percentages and statistics, but to your point, Diana, I mean, I get a lot of people aren't, and having real values associated with that corresponds to what is being presented here just might help put things into perspective for people. So just to support what you're saying, I don't think it's a bad suggestion, and I think it's just a matter, Jim, of providing some of those examples that show the whole dollar value instead of in a percentage. That's all.
Thanks. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good feedback. I mean, I think we could do a better job of remembering who our audience is, the fact that our audience is really varied, and just kind of speaking in terms that really put things into context, like you say, with the impacts on our daily lives here. So we'll definitely take that forward into future presentations.
Yeah, as a reminder as well, pardon me, as a reminder, the whatever that number is for the municipality on our tax bill, we also do collections for the regional district, SD6, and the hospital board. Anybody else? Those three are the primaries anyway.
Yeah, Municipal Finance Authority, BC Assessment.
For a couple of other numbers. So when a tax bill goes out, approximately 74% of it goes to the municipality. The other 26% goes to these other sources. So I know we always get feedback coming back in that we talk about a certain increase. Let's say it's $200 a home, but it ends up being $300. And why did you mislead me when you said that? So I just want to lay that out there as a reminder that when we get to that point where the tax bills are going out, it's probably worthwhile to have that conversation again, just so that we are prepared for, the feedback.
Yes, that's an excellent
Okay.
point. And I'll add on that as an individual's assessed value will also impact the tax increase that they see on their bill. So if they go up more than the average,
The average.
yes,
Yep,
then
great,
they'll see an increase
Yeah,
of
great.
beyond that 6.99%.
Okay, I'm going to call the question on receipt. All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion is carried. All right, bear with me, council, while I run down. There's about 8 or 10 other motions that we need to do individually here. The first is that council approve for inclusion in the 2025 to 2029 5-year financial plan, the proposed adjustments to the 2025 general operating base budget as identified on slides 13 to 25 in the presentation. Councillor McBain moves. Councillor Karen seconds. Further discussion? All those in favor? That motion is carried. Next up is that property tax collections in 2025 be increased. Do we have that? So is this 6.68 correct?
Yes, it's just the
It's
internal.
cumulative of the other. Okay.
Yep, and then
So the motion is that property tax collections for 2025 be increased by 6.68%, inclusive of a dedicated 1.5% increase for transfer to capital reserves. Councillor McBain moves. Councillor Karen seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried. That council approve for inclusion in the 25 to 29 5-year financial plan bylaw, the Kimberley Helping Hands Food Bank external budget request for a long-term grant of $25,000 in accordance with the community grants policy. Can I have a mover, please? Councillor Roberts moves. Councillor McBain seconds. Further discussion? You want any discussion on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up that this is pretty inconsistent practice as far as grant approvals go. I don't know if we're approving the budget right now and that this will go to the grant committee or if we're actually approving the grant itself.
the community grants policy, for long-term grant requests, it's indicated that it would come to council for consideration, and the project event grants go to the grant committee for review. So that's the distinction, is whether it's a project
So-
event.
The answer is yes. We're approving the long-term grant as part of inclusion in the budget.
Yeah, it's just a little bit inconsistent because last year we approved it totally differently, and you know, in the future, I'm under the impression that this is going to go once every 5 years. So it's just inconsistent practice is what I'm pointing out here.
Thanks for that, Councillor McGuire. I think our manager of community development has highlighted a gap in the updated policy as we had reviewed, and is in the process of making recommendations that they in fact will close that gap. Because at this point in time, you know, my fear is that we've got 30 or 40 other not-for-profits that are going to come to council and ask for long-term grants. And I find it hard to believe that we would just say, okay, and go pay for that with a tax increase.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with approving for 1 year or approving a portion of this for the next 4 or 3, I guess it is, until we review this standing grant.
I think this would be for 18 months to the end of the council term. And then when the new council term starts, all of the standing grants need to be reapplied at that point.
I believe that's scheduled for a year after the next council is elected.
After Okay, could be. Yeah, I may have that timing a little out. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, the policy changes that were approved in October last year say that it's December 31st of the year following the local general elections. I guess just to
Okay.
give the new council a bit of time to get up to speed on that, but you're quite right. There have been some gaps identified with the long-term grant procedure. One of them being that the policy indicates that we'll receive applications at any time, as opposed to the program grants where it's, there's a deadline set each year. And by saying that we'll receive them at any time throughout the year, I mean, if we receive a grant in June after the budget's been set, we obviously can't, adjust revenues to pay for that. So, I mean, there's some things that we need to address in that policy for sure.
Yeah. Further? Okay. Call the question then. All those in favor of the long-term grant for Kimberley Helping Hands Food Bank? That motion is passed. Next up is that council approve for inclusion in the 25 to 29 5-year financial plan bylaw, the Kimberley Nature Park Society's external budget request for a $16,000 long-term grant in accordance with the community grants policy commencing in 2025. Councillor Cairns moves. Councillor McBain seconds. Further discussion? All those in favor? That motion is carried. That council directs staff to include a dedicated 1.5% increase to property tax collections for transfer directly to general capital reserves in 2026 and subsequent years. Mover, please. Councillor Roberts, thank you. And Councillor Fox seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried. That council direct a transfer to general capital reserves equal to the full unbudgeted property tax collection resulting from non-market assessment change. Mover, please. Councillor McBain, thank you. Councillor Fox seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried. That council approve for inclusion in the 20.
Mr. Mayor, these resolutions capture what has been talked about so far, so I thought I'd proceed with the remainder of the presentation.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Remaining resolutions?
I will mark where we left off.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Krista.
No problem. So this next discussion is regarding the aquatic center parcel tax. And as you may recall, a change back in 2019 resulted in 100% of the facility operating deficit and debt payments being funded through the aquatic center parcel tax. And as parcel tax revenue can only be used for the purpose for which it was imposed, any excess revenue over expenditures in any given year is held in reserves, and then it is subsequently budgeted to be transferred out to reduce the level of the parcel tax in that year. So at the end of 2023, the balance of the aquatic center parcel tax reserve was $54,542. And in 2024, it was planned to be withdrawn to reduce the 2024 parcel tax levy. And based on preliminary calculations for 2024, the aquatic center had higher than expected revenues and lower than expected expenditures, resulting in excess revenue of approximately $4,934. So this would allow us to actually put those funds back into the parcel tax reserve rather than withdrawing. So if those numbers remain the same, we can transfer that $4,000 back into the reserve, increasing its balance to $59,476, which will apply against the 2025 parcel tax levy. So, and that calculation is on the next slide. So for 2025, we had the operating budget, budgeted operating revenue of $361,000, expenditures of $1.2 million, debt payment, and I've noted there that it's the final debt payment in 2025 is $186,906. So the anticipated deficit for 2025 is $77,481. And if we apply that $59,000 reserve that we're anticipating as a result of the 2024 preliminary calculation, the adjusted aquatic center deficit would be $1,018,005. And splitting that across the property parcels as anticipated in the completed roll, That would result in a parcel tax levy for 2025 at $216.23, which would be a $2.50 increase from 2024. And I've just noted that without that transfer of the reserve, or with that transfer of reserve, it allowed for a reduction of $12.63 to the levy. And then for 2026, with the removal of the aquatic center debt, we would see a reduction. We could see a reduction in the parcel tax levy. However, we would also have the depletion of the parcel tax reserve. So if we see the net impact of both of those, it could potentially change the parcel tax levy or reduce it by $27 next year or 2026.
That would be nice. It's been a long time coming.
Yes.
I think 20 years.
Yes,
It was a 20-year term.
Yep.
Must have been, yeah.
it was.
Yep. Councillor McGuire.
Yeah, I'm just going to admit that I didn't understand any of that.
Okay. I'm sorry.
And I think that the important part here is that we're increasing it by $2.50 this year, and we'll probably decrease.
Correct.
No, increase or decrease next year?
Decrease because
Decrease by $27 next year. Okay. $2.50 increase this year, $27 reduction next year. Okay, I'm following now.
Thank you, Councillor McGuire. Further? Go ahead.
Okay. So the next slide, we're not seeking direction at this time. We need those figures from the revised assessment rule that's coming out at the end of this month, early April, in order to finalize those numbers. And then we can bring that back to council to prepare the amendment for to the parcel tax imposition bylaw for 2025. Okay, if we move out of the general fund and into the water fund and some proposed adjustments, there's not much for either, but some noted adjustments here is increasing water revenue by $39,000 to reflect increases for the metered water purchases. So that's reflective of the bulk water rate increases we've seen, but still remaining, keeping it conservative. So that would see an increase in revenues of $39,000. And in addition, the department is requesting an additional $28,000 for water sampling. And that's a result of an increase in fees for laboratory rates to test those samples, and as well as the requirements from Interior Health and Health Canada requiring additional testing. So the water department has requested this additional amount to fund those additional testing, as well as the inflationary increases on those. So the net impact of both of those is actually a reduction to the water operating budget of $10,341. And as noted below, we're proposing that that be directed to the water capital reserve. And if we go to the next, we have the resolutions corresponding with both of those recommendations.
All right, first one up is that council approve for inclusion in the 25-29 5-year financial plan bylaw the proposed adjustments to the, pardon me, to the 2025 water operating base budget as detailed in the slide presentation. Councillor Roberts moves, Councillor Karen seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried. And second, that the adjustments to the 2025 water operating base budgets as approved be offset by a corresponding adjustment to the water capital reserve. In other words, we take that 10 grand and we move it into the reserve. Councillor McBain moves and Councillor Fox seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried.
Thank you very much. And on to the sewer fund. It's the base budget is deemed to be sufficient to operate for 2025, so there are no requested changes.
All right, so that brings us to the last two resolutions.
Correct.
First is that council directs staff to prepare the 25-29 5-year financial plan bylaw and that the bylaw be brought forward at the April 14th regular meeting for consideration of first 3 readings. Councillor Roberts moves, Councillor Karen seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried. And finally, that council directs staff to prepare the 2025 tax rates bylaw, and that the bylaw be brought forward at the April 14th regular meeting for consideration of first three readings. Councillor McBain moves and Councillor Fox seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried.
Excellent. Thank you, Mayor and Council.
Final comments?
Just the last slide there proposes next steps, which as in the previous resolutions, just indicates that we'll be bringing the 5-year financial plan bylaw, the tax rate bylaw, the aquatic center parcel tax amendment bylaw for first three readings at the April 12th, 2025 regular meeting. Hopeful for adoption on April 28th, which would get us in prior to the May 15th deadline. So that during that week, we can process and mail property tax notice and get those out.
Wow, not much margin for error.
No, they're never
Moving this
never is.
forward. We always seem to get right down to that May 15th deadline. Council, final comments? All right, excellent job, Krista. The management of the city is complex.
Yes.
And we thank you for the efforts in putting all this together in a way that, well, almost all of it is understandable.
99%.
99%. Thanks for all the hard work.
Thank you very much.
Okay, move adjournment. Councillor McBain moves and Councillor Dunneback seconds. All those in favor? That motion is carried. We're done. Thanks, folks.